Ricoeur believes that the science of linguistics is deductively structured, and he is, moreover, prepared to use it as a model to analyze the language forms of a plethora of narrative types which he otherwise claims is so varied that it would be an impossible task for induction to arrive at any explanatory results. He quotes Saussure and his distinction between the code of language, which is systematic, and the message of language, which is diachronically historical. The limitation of such an approach is, of course, that the sentence is the primary object of analysis, and larger units such as texts are composed of the atoms of these sentences and subjected to a structural analysis. Ricoeur quotes Roland Barthes on the topic of the so-called organic whole of the literary text, but this account relies on a transactional relation between a sender and a hearer which materializes the message to such an extent that it is no longer recognized to be something that is understood. Ricoeur also, in the context of this discussion, recommends detaching nomological considerations from contexts of understanding, on the grounds that there is no identity relation existing between them. The strategy of Saussure's linguistic theory is to some extent shared by Ricoeur, and involves the marginalization of diachronical historical concerns in favor of a synchrony of structure, but this in this turn involves a failure to acknowledge the extent to which history, in fact, favors a rational imperative-driven structure. On such an account of history, historical diachrony is explained, justified and understood in terms of operative principles and laws. Ricoeur, in the course of this discussion, suddenly sees the need for another kind of rational structure and invokes the atomistic science of linguistics, rather than the more molecular approach we find in historical reasoning. Linguistic structuralism also has a tendency to invoke abstractions which are ethically neutral, e.g., functions, which are means-ends variables, that tend to divide the whole significance of action into action segments, manifesting different instrumental concerns. Ricoeur refers to Propp's morphology of the folk tale. Propp's morphology is essentially characterized by the primacy it gives to functions over characters. By a function, he means segments of action, or more exactly, abstract forms of action such as abstention, interdiction, violation, reconnaissance, delivery, trickery, and complicity. Page 33. The actions listed are actions that are attributable to an agent or character, and it is clear that Propp is attempting, controversially, to transfigure an essentially cultural object into a scientific object. Page 38. The science of preference that is invoked by Ricoeur in support of this position is sociology, and it is then suggested with reference to the work of Claude Brenaud, Logique du récit, that characters ought to be transformed into roles, and a list of principal narrative roles should be drawn up. Page 40. It is then suggested that roles ought to be inserted into a field of evaluations. Page 41. Ricoeur then claims, paradoxically, a logic of possible narrative acts is still only a logic of action. Page 43. It is the task of the plot, it is argued, to transform action into narrative. What is missing from this account, however, is the extent to which the principles that are operating in the process of plot construction are essence-specifying, ethically speaking, with a teleological emphasis that prioritizes ends, and the power the end has of conferring meaning on the beginning and middle segments of the narrative. Instead, on Ricoeur's account, the reader is led from the beginning to the end of the narrative, and they are encouraged to think in a context of exploration/discovery. The creator's perspective, however, is embedded in a context of explanation/justification which begins at the level of the essence-specifying principles and the teleological ends of the narrative. Seeking for rationality via an exercise of dialectical logic that attempts to synthesize two activities abstracted from very different kinds of context is not a useful exercise seen from the context of explanation/justification. Both hylomorphic and critical philosophy see a fundamental logical difference between propositions referring to activities and these logically distinguishable types of context. Principles regulating an inductive exploration on the part of the audience and principles regulating the creation of the narrative, however, can be shared on the condition that the context of explanation/justification is primary. But this is clearly not the position Ricoeur occupies. Todorov does not speak of principles, but of a synthesis of the roles of a plot, the grammar of narrative, and Ricoeur criticizes this position thus: to know all the roles is not yet to know any plot whatsoever. Page 43. Mink is also referred to, and he takes us further up the ladder of rationalist abstraction with talk of an act of judgment, which, it is claimed, relates to the praxis of narrative. Ricoeur neutralizes the rationalist implications of this appeal by claiming that this act of judgment has little to do with what he characterizes as the logic of the narrative. St. Augustine's view of time is preferred to that of Aristotle's, perhaps because of the so-called metaphysical implications of the Aristotelian account, and perhaps also because of a prior commitment on the part of Ricoeur to linguistic structuralism, which lies behind the doubt about the relation between the logic or rationality of the narrative and our understanding of narrative. Add to this the wish to locate this debate in the transactional circumstances of sender and receiver, and we have marginalized the context of explanation/justification in favor of the context of exploration/discovery. Of course, it is always an empirical possibility that the receiver of a message will not understand its, e.g., that X was an evil tyrant. The creator of the message, however, assumes that the it is sufficiently universal to reasonably expect that it will be understood as intended. Ricoeur's transactional commitment rests partly upon an interest in Danto's theory of action and narrative sentences. This structure of sentences that describe action has been the object of much detailed work in analytic philosophy. One noteworthy characteristic of these sentences is that they involve an open-ended structure running from "Socrates says" to "Brutus killed Caesar on the Ides of March in the Roman Senate with a knife." It is this semantics of action that, in fact, is presupposed in the theory of the narrative sentence. Page 57. This reliance on the intentional logic of the analytical philosopher, for whom the world is essentially a totality of facts, and scientific investigation proceeds principally in the context of exploration/discovery is, to say the least, surprising. Given the commitments to Husserl and Heidegger, reference to an essentially descriptive position embedded in a methodologically oriented science in which variables are manipulated and measured in accordance with hypotheticals, is problematic, given that narrative is essentially an imperative-driven enterprise. Action sentences that are open-ended, without clear intent, are sentences that do not belong within the domain of the tribunal of explanation/justification. Very general open sentences are by definition strategically ambiguous, and subject to a logic of probability, which most classical creators of narratives would seek to avoid. The ethical imperative that is operative in narrative works is not hypothetical or instrumental, but rather subject to a necessity that must be categorical in nature. The ethical message must be universal and necessary, and not subject to strategic ambiguity. It is true that the creator of a work of art must also produce a unique object, but this does not involve introducing ambiguity into the ethical message by varying the essential nature of the message. The uniqueness condition in such circumstances has more to do with varying the way in which the message is presented. If one chooses to invert the ethical image and, per impossible, in Aristotle's terms, aim at the bad, rather than the good, the result might well be shocking and raise questions as to whether one is any longer dealing with a work of art.